Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at changes in medical training over time. So to start with, let's have a quick look at ancient Roman medical training. So in ancient Roman times, observation was a key method of figuring out your medical knowledge. So for example, Hippocrates in ancient Greek times had already said that people should observe their patients, watch them and note down their symptoms and pass that information on so other doctors can use it. And that continued in Roman times with people like Galen also suggesting that everyone should use observation and watch their patients to see what was wrong with them. Another way that people would learn in Roman times about anatomy of the human body is through wars. There were lots of wars as the Romans had a huge empire, and also through gladiators. So at home in probably the most famous one, the Roman Colosseum. But also you would see the similar sort of thing going on in Britain at the time. There were places where people would fight for fun. It was a Roman form of entertainment, and the gladiators would get various injuries, and that would enable the gladiator doctors to look inside of the body and see a little bit more about it and learn more about anatomy through injuries. So partly through chance and partly through war as a factor there. Another way that ancient Romans would learn about the body and how they were going to treat their patients is through books. The most famous library that was used was the Alexandria Library, which was actually in Egypt, but this was part of the Romans Empire. And the books there contained a wealth of knowledge from all over Europe and slightly further afield as well. It had been started again by the Greeks, but the Romans had taken this over, and all sorts of medical knowledge was there in those books. Largely these books would have been based on the work of Galen and Hippocrates, as they'd probably written the most books by this time period. And there were other ideas as well, so the ancient Egyptians had learned things about anatomy through mummification, and some of those ideas would also be seen in books in the ancient Roman Empire when they were training. Additionally, another way that the Romans would learn about the body or learn about how to treat people was through public dissection. The most famous person to do any public dissections was, I'm sure you've heard of him before, Galen. Now, Galen was particularly interested in dissection to prove how the body worked, and he proved through public dissection of a live pig that the brain controlled the body. So he was showing people how the body worked, although it wasn't on a human and it wasn't an animal, because he mainly dissected pigs and apes. These public dissections would enable sort of medical students and other doctors to learn from his work and to pass that knowledge on. Well, what about medieval times, when we went further through to medieval times? Well, some things would continue on. So we still have training, which was based on books. So for example, university training at the time in medieval period was run by the church mainly. This meant that there was no dissection of human bodies allowed. And they did do some sort of dissections, but it would have to be on animals. And everything was around proving the work of Galen, and Galen wasn't allowed to be questioned. Towards the very end of the medieval period, they started to allow dissection of human bodies, but even then, again, university training was all about proving the work of Galen, so no new ideas would come out of this training. So it was quite conservative training that would be received by doctors at this time. Other methods of training in the medieval period included apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is learning something on the job, or sort of watching someone else who's an expert doing it and learning by doing that and having a go. So for example, apothecaries, which is like a pharmacy today, so you might go to a pharmacy like Boots or a chemist's or something like that to go and get medicines today. Well, in medieval times a similar sort of thing was around, which was an apothecary. These people, unlike today where someone might go to a university and study for a long time to become a pharmacist, in medieval times apothecaries were run by people who learnt by just an apprenticeship. So whoever had run the apothecary before them, their little shop of medicines, would pass on what they knew and any local remedies and that sort of thing. They might have books called herbals, which contained lots of lists of herbal remedies and plant mixtures that people could use to keep themselves healthy. Some of these may actually have worked, some of them wouldn't have, but it was more a case of chance rather than necessarily great training. Another group of people who might have used apprenticeships to train in medieval times were barber surgeons. These were people who would do things from pulling out teeth to simple surgeries like perhaps cutting a visible tumour, not an internal one, but perhaps a visible growth or tumour off that they could see, as well as maybe cutting your hair, hence being called a barber surgeon. So apprenticeships is one way that they would learn in the medieval period. And then we've got sort of similar to apprenticeships, we have local healers. So local healers, again, no university education. It's even less likely that they might have had access to books. The local healers, even in the Renaissance, were largely women, many of whom wouldn't necessarily have been literate, as they wouldn't have been able to read or write. And they were known as wise women. They were probably people who had lots of life experience. Perhaps they were older women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and people who had seen lots of births and would have helped at lots of births, and they would observe people's illnesses, and they'd pass down information about things that they'd tried that seemed to have worked, so maybe herbal remedies that they had used, or knowledge that they had of what you might be able to do if a woman got into difficulty when giving birth. There were also, obviously, in the medieval period, there was the church who would help with treatment. And the training of people in the church hospitals, who were largely monks and nuns, was more based on care, not cure. So it was more about religious training, so lots of prayer and that sort of thing to help their patients. And there would have been an element of some monastery hospitals or some church hospitals might have also had access to libraries. They might have had their own sort of chained libraries, and in those libraries they might have had access to herbals, so they might have read some books on herbals that they could also have used as part of their training. Now, looking forward into the Renaissance period, we can see that some things continued and some things start to change. So university training continues as a method of training for medical practice. We see public dissection, something we've also seen in the Roman period, but the difference from medieval to Renaissance training in this case is university dissections allowed public dissection of human bodies for the first time. And this led to new discoveries and new ideas was being circulated. So training was an ongoing process rather than something that you did at the beginning of your career and simply left after that point. However, there was still a lot of conservatism. So just like university training in the medieval period, where we said that they were only allowed to use the work of Galen and it wasn't allowed to be questioned, well, there's a little bit more movement. They do start to question Galen's ideas and to come up with their new ideas, but things like new discoveries like Harvey's discovery about the heart, it took about 50 years before it was actually accepted and taught in universities. And the same sort of thing went along with Vesalius. In fact, Vesalius is a really good example of conservatism in universities. So Vesalius was doing dissections on human bodies, and obviously when he did that, he discovered that Galen had made a number of mistakes on things like the liver and the human jaw and things like that. And yet his earliest works show the liver exactly as Galen had described it in one of the drawings that he created called the tabulae sex. They're big, basically 6 huge big pictures of the insides of the human body. He had instructed the artist to draw the liver with 6 sort of little lobes, even though he would have seen that there were only 2. So there's real evidence there that there was conservatism in university training very similarly to the medieval period. So dissection, we've briefly mentioned already. Harvey discovered how the heart worked. Vesalius discovered things about the jaw, the liver, and the heart not having holes in it. We've also got the print press at this period, so it's much easier for people to learn and train using books because they would be much more widely available than they had been previously. However, we do see the continuation of apprenticeships for barber surgeons and apothecaries, and we also see the rise also of potentially fraudulent training. So we've got quack doctors in this period, people who would have no university training. It seems unlikely that they would have had much medical training either in the form of books or necessarily apprenticeships if we were to believe the sources left behind. On the other hand, one could argue that quack doctors' patients were mainly very poor patients because they didn't charge as much as professional university trained doctors, and most of those poorer patients wouldn't have been able to read or write, so they wouldn't have been able to write down any evidence that we would have access to about how good the quack doctors were. So the only sources that we have about quack doctors are actually written and created by rich doctors and rich patients who would have looked down on these cheaper doctors, the quack doctors, and therefore sort of sniffed at them and said that they were rubbish and no good and fraudulent, when actually perhaps some of the things that they were saying and doing might have worked. So if we go a little further on and we look into the period 1750 to 1900, which is the sort of industrial period, the Victorian period you might know it as. It's the time when we have industrialisation, so the building of factories, and you'll also know it as a famous period for epidemics like the cholera outbreaks and things like that. So again, we have the continuation of public dissections. So Vesalius in the Renaissance have been known for doing public dissections, so lots of people could go along and watch, and also had illustrators come along and artists to draw what he saw. Similarly, in the industrial period, we see people like John Hunter coming along, and John Hunter was famous for employing secretaries to write down his findings when he was doing these public dissections of human bodies, and artists to draw his findings as well. So he did lots of detailed analysis, for example, of pregnant women and the babies inside of their wombs and various other sort of aspects that hadn't been covered by previous doctors, and this would lead to better training for knowledge of anatomy than we'd seen in the past. But definitely in this way, dissection or public dissections is something we see as a continuous method of training from Roman times through in the Renaissance and in the industrial period as well. We see a slight change. There's more professionalisation going on with training for the first time in the industrial period, in the sort of 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. We see the Society of Apothecaries and the Royal College of Surgeons forming. Now, what were they and what did they do? Well, the really important things that the the Society of Apothecaries and the Royal College of Surgeons do is in 1815 they come up with the idea that you have to have an exam before you can do the job of being a doctor. Seems like a brilliant idea to me, because it's checking that this person has the capability to treat you without killing you. So it's only in the industrial period that we see that happen. Previously, anyone could go along and attend university, and just by being there, the default into becoming a doctor. Now they have to pass an exam before they can do the job. Additionally, the Royal College of Surgeons started something called the General Medical Council in 1858. And the General Medical Council was designed to register all doctors, so it was designed to make sure that everyone was registered, so you couldn't have someone claiming that they'd passed their exams and were able to do their job, when in actual fact they hadn't, because you could check on the General Medical Council's list of doctors to see if they really were a doctor or not. We see the continuation as well of so that's a big change, but we do see the continuation of observation, apprenticeships and university training, but there's slight changes to it. So for example, there were teaching hospitals, so there's a real emphasis put on shadowing doctors with experience in the industrial period, and they're meant to be set up to teach and to give opportunities for student doctors to learn. We see new equipment, meaning that training is going to be more high-tech and based around new technologies, and the more doctors that were trained with these new technologies, the more new discoveries would be made and then more people would be saved. So for example, the stethoscope's invented in 1816, the microscope becomes 1,000 times stronger as made by Lister. We see the invention of a 5-minute thermometer that can very quickly take your temperature. So all of these things would have made it easier for new doctors training to diagnose their patients. And we also see in the 1850s, so in the sort of mid-19th century, a very famous woman come along, Florence Nightingale, and she went over during the Crimean War to the Crimea, and she does lots of work there in nursing. So she decreases the death rate by about 50%. And the press absolutely love her, and they publish loads of articles. So when she returns after the Crimean War into Britain. She's able to get loads of funding from the campaigns of the newspapers, and she sets up in 1861 her own school of nursing. This was the first official school of nursing. Previously, people just read a book. I mean, there wasn't an exam, there was nothing to check that you were capable as a nurse. Nurses had a reputation of being drunks, being asleep on duty, being people who really didn't care about their patients. But after Florence Nightingale came along in 1861 with the School of Nursing and the 200 books that she wrote on nursing, nursing became much more professional, and people were much more effective. And then finally, we need to take into consideration the 20th century. So let's have a look at similarities and differences we can see here. So in the 20th century, we see a continuation of this new professionalisation of medicine. So universities encouraging research and new ideas with dissection and research and things like that. We see the continuation of exams and observations, so a focus on shadowing other doctors and learning through experience, and the General Medical Council as well. So lots of similarities between these two periods in terms of professionalisation of medicine and making sure people have enough experience before they practice on their own. We also see war becoming a major factor in training and in changes in training. So, for example, World War One, we see people being much more widely trained on new pieces of technology. There's a necessity for governments to fund this new training. So, for example, the best thing which illuminates this would be the X-ray. It's invented just before the 20th century, at the end of the 1800s, by a man called Wilhelm Röntgen, a German man, and not many people bothered to invest in the technology or to use it or to train anyone in how to use it. But during World War One, we see lots of shrapnel wounds and shrapnel victims, and it's necessary for doctors on the battlefields to be able to have access to and be trained in the use of technology like X-rays to save those soldiers. Again, in terms of changes in training, we see the same sort of thing in World War II with new injuries, meaning that there's a need for plastic surgery to develop as well. So it leads to new observation and experimentation war, but also investment in training and wide training in new technology. We see a continuation in the professionalisation of nursing. So by 1901, there were 68,000 trained nurses due to mainly the nursing school set up by Nightingale. In 1850, there'd been absolutely none. And that's something which continues exponentially in the 20th century. So we see more and more nurses professionally trained and with some sort of qualification behind them. We also see, sort of linked to the one above, an increase in government funding. And this comes along with the necessity of war, but also a demand of the population and of the voting public to the governments. So initially we see an increase in things like free school meals and that aspect of public health, but we also eventually see a pressure for training of doctors through the NHS and dentists, and making sure that there were enough trained doctors and ample people to be nurses in the NHS hospitals. So there's a need for the government to support the funding of that sort of training. So we see many similarities and differences over time. I'd say key similarities would probably be observation is a major part of training through all of these periods, even the medieval period where the church is trying to force everyone to believe Galen. They still do some public dissections, even if it's supposed to be an observation to prove Galen, there is still observation there. And we see books being used to disseminate information, specifically medieval period Galen's books and Hippocrates' books. And then with the printing press of the Renaissance, books are even more widely used. We see books again with the School of Nursing and the 200 books that Nightingale had written. And in the 20th century, those books continue to be a factor as well. I'd say the key differences in training are probably fairly clear after this sort of industrial period and the 20th century. There's a move towards more professionalisation, exams, registering people as being ready to practice and that kind of thing. So there's that change that we see. So consider making yourself perhaps a grid of key similarities and differences between different periods, so you can practice ready for those exam questions in your exams this summer. Good luck with your revision.